Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. We're here to talk about admissions trends, testing. We've got a lot of questions from you. We're excited to answer them. We're encouraging you to certainly join in and ask questions live. We've got people queuing into the room right now, but while we wait to do that, I'm Barry Norman. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be doing some initial introductions in a moment, but just a couple of housekeeping things. If you do have questions that you'd like to ask us, either follow-ups to what we're discussing or new things that you'd like us to tackle, just put them in the Q&A or the chat, but preferably the Q&A so we can keep track of them. And we'll be looking at them throughout, and we'll answer whatever we can as we go. And we'll be doing a poll shortly to get a sense of the audience, and then we'll take it from there. So I'm going to hand it over to Leslie, our moderator. So Leslie, without further ado.
Okay. Hi, so I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and I am very excited to be your moderator tonight for college admissions, testing, and everything you need to know with Barry Norman, the co-founder of Expert Admissions, and Sasha DeWin, the CEO of Tutor Associates. It's going to be a great evening. I think what we would like to do is start with a poll. Barry, I'm going
to launch that right now. We'd love to get a sense of the audience, especially for the purposes of speaking about everything, but especially testing, because we've got a new SAT, a digital SAT on the horizon that impacts students differently depending on what grade they're in. So if you're a student, fill it out for you. If you're a parent, let us know about your student, and that way we can tailor some of our responses and also some of the questions to the audience. People are still answering, so give us a moment. All right, so it looks like we've got about 35% 11th graders, 31% 12th graders, and then 19% 10th graders, and no 9th graders on here, it says, and other 15%. So we've got mostly 11th and 12th graders on here. Thank you for joining us. We know that those are students and parents who are most interested and often kind of further into the process, certainly, and thinking about these things.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to start off with some of the testing questions, as you already alluded to. What's the state of the SAT, ACTs? Anything new? Are kids testing? Do they need to?
Yeah, well, thank you, Leslie, and I'm so excited to chat with everyone tonight. Yes, in some ways, things are sort of back to normal, whatever normal means. All of our seniors certainly are either finishing testing or had an opportunity to test. Our juniors are just gearing up. It's early still. And our sophomores are sort of thinking about making decisions about this down the line this school year. And, you know, for our seniors, well, nothing's changing for y'all. We'll talk admissions in a moment, but you're done and you've made your choices. And same thing really goes for the juniors, with the sort of slight little exception for international students. 10th graders, current 10th graders, or parents of current 10th graders, 9th graders, parents of current 9th graders. We have a new SAT coming our way. In the fall of next year is the PSAT, and the spring of 2024 is that new SAT. We can get into some of the details about that. But the really quick thing is they've turned it digital. So it's going to be on a computer at a testing center, and it's going to be shorter, just 2 hours, and it's going to be adaptive. So how you perform on the first module will have an impact on what the second module delivered to you is. And there's lots and lots of other details, but I won't have you worry about anything other than that. This doesn't really relevant for current juniors and seniors or parents of those kids. And for sophomores and 9th graders, it's just the beginning to think about this anyway. And we can get into the details of whether or not that new SAT might make sense for your child versus the ACT, which has always been the sort of tried and true option on the other side of things.
Barry, for the 11th graders, is test optional? Is it test optional now? Going forward, does not submitting a score hurt my chances? And that may be true for some seniors as well. They may be interested in this answer.
Absolutely. This is one of the most common questions that we get. So, listen, we don't know for sure, but I would make the assumption, I think it's a pretty safe bet to assume that test optional is here to stay. Might we have some schools that go back the way that MIT did? Sure, but I would not expect this to be the norm. So that's, again, based on just my experience and just sort of my guess and my sense of things and how things have progressed since test optional was introduced more broadly, but we'll see. We've had some schools make further announcements about extending the policies for anywhere from an additional 1 to 3 years, just even in the last few weeks. And I think that, it's pretty much here to stay. So that is good news for some people. It definitely complicates the overall picture because the numbers, as we know from last year, went through the roof. Test optional opens more doors for everybody. And so with the increased application numbers, you've got lower admit rates and sort of tighter admissions pools. And so there's sort of a plus and a minus, if you would, to test optional, but I do think it's here to stay. I do think that it's school dependent on how crucial it is to send a score. And I think it also depends on the student as well. At some schools, it's clear that they prefer scores. At others, it seems pretty even, but I think everything is student specific. But what I will say overall, and it's not going to be easy for individuals necessarily to sort of pinpoint this for themselves. But if you're truly like an extraordinary fit, and not fit, I don't mean you think you fit, I mean on the admission side, that they're going to see you as a good fit for their community through your essays and through the recommendations and how your whole profile comes together, that if all of that is aligned and you can't send your score because it's going to knock you out or it'll just be too weak, then I don't think it's something that will significantly hinder you. I wouldn't change strategy based on it. I wouldn't turn the whole, kind of list around because of it. But if you're kind of somebody who's in range, a good fit, but it's not quite all there, having the score or not having the score might be a differentiator. I actually was talking to an admissions officer recently, and they phrased it in just a way that I feel like only an admissions officer could. They said about scores that it's another way that students can show that they're taking advantage of all opportunities available to them, which was such an admissions response. It wasn't saying we prefer them, but it was suggesting that there was some judgment based on whether or not you were taking them depending on what access you had. It was a very carefully curated answer, I think. But I think that it depends on the school and it depends on the student. But I wouldn't say overall that without it, again, the whole strategy has to be reconsidered. So it depends, but I think it's one thing I will say is that you should try for the score if you can, right? Work as hard as you can as if it wasn't test optional. If you can't get there, you can't get there, and you have this kind of safety net, if you would, that didn't exist just a few years ago, and that's a good thing overall.
For those who are, how do you make an informed decision about which test is right for you or your child? And do kids ever take both, send scores for both? So going back, if you are starting out in the testing and you're not going test optional.
Sure. Or even if you've done some testing, you're sending one test or the other, you're certainly not sending both. So if you've prepared for both, it's probably because you picked the test that wasn't really ideal for you and then you switched gears. But otherwise, you're absolutely picking one or the other. Nobody wants to see both, and sending both doesn't make any sense. And in terms of picking the right test, certainly there are generalities, just like Barry was saying about what tends to be right for kids, but really the best way to figure out the right test is to sit for a full-length ACT and a full-length SAT. I usually tell parents, like, no rush on this, sometime at the end of sophomore year. Sometimes schools do it at school, so we really don't want to interfere with that. They're already hosting it maybe at their school. Sometimes schools don't. Spring break, June of sort of after 10th grade, you take a full SAT, you take a full ACT with the accommodations you think you'll have in place, and we can discuss those. And then you can really line them up. And sometimes it's quite obvious just from the scores themselves, which test is right. Or from the experience from the kids. Other times it's not so obvious and you have to dig into the why behind the scores. You know, maybe one score will be easier to move than another for various reasons. And then there's some other things you can kind of factor in as you make those decisions. You know, overwhelmingly, I like to think of the ACT as maybe the long, steady, not so fun road that always looks the same. And it's not fun. No one wants to take that road, I guess I would say, but I know exactly what it looks like. And some kids really like the road that looks exactly the same every time, even if it's difficult, and it is difficult. And the SAT is like a little bit more bumpy, a little bit more surprising. I think that's sort of the game of the SAT, is that it's not so predictable, but it's certainly maybe a little bit more of an interesting road for some kids. And that's really just an analogy that oversimplifies that both of these tests are really testing similar skills in different ways. They're kind of like different games or different languages. Either can be learned. And so when Barry said, if you can't get there, you can't get there, that's right. And really the kids who can't get there, usually it has to do with when they're starting or where they're starting. And you should know that early on, because there's an opportunity cost to your child's time. And that's also what Barry was saying, right? You know, if at what cost do these scores come? Certainly not at the cost of grades or sleep or all those important extracurriculars that they're going to need to present, and all the sort of important rich activities they're having. But if you start early and you pick the right thing and you know what you're doing, they are very learnable. They really, both of them are. It's like two different games that if you know the rules and you have the right people helping you understand those rules, and you can perform under pressure, which is a big and we're really big on helping kids learn how to do that, then you can beat the game. And I think that is overwhelmingly true for our students, though not exclusively true. And again, then it becomes a question of how do we use this limited time our children have, especially in this busy time. But full length diagnostics are the way to go. Don't do a hybrid, don't do a mix and match. And the time is really the end of sophomore year to talk about this and to plan for this. And I will look at PSAT scores. I will look at the plan, which is like the shortened ACT. And I guess I like to say with those, if your child did exceptionally well on those, it's predictive to me of what's going to happen. If they didn't do well, I kind of just toss them aside and they don't mean that much to me. Most kids don't know how to play the game, and not knowing how to play the game, it's not that surprising to me. I see it all the time. And we need to dig into sort of what's missing there, and which game might be easier and more pleasant to take over and over again on those Saturday morning practice tests. So
kind of begs the question, what scores should a kid go for? And is there a cutoff? And both of you can answer this.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because I think test optional has changed just a little bit. I mean, Barry and I have been watching this change over decades, actually, even before test optional, but test optional has certainly shifted up the kinds of scores that a lot of schools will like sort of expect in terms of it aiding your application. There's no cutoff, but these scores, these schools will let you know how applicants who were admitted did on these tests over previous years. They do publish this data. So if you want to know what admitted students scored when they were admitted to Yale, it's online. They'll give you the 25th or 75th percentile of admitted students. Barry's going to say, go be on the top end of that. And so there's no cutoff, certainly, but there are scores that we know will help you, and there are scores we know will not. And that's actually pretty clear. And again, it's school by school and child by child, but it's not that gray either.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, for us, we always see it as the goal with the scores is them to be high enough that you clear the bar so they don't pause at them. They just move past them. So a super, super high score is not what's going to get you in, but you don't want to submit a score that's going to keep you out. And so if you can submit a score where they can just sort of saunter past it and say, great, good, and then they pass it, great. If it's anything else, then you're going to want to think twice about sending it. And what that looks like depends on the school. One thing also that you have to take into consideration is the composition, is the different section scores, right? And I was looking at a profile earlier today where it was 35s and 36s on 3 sections and then a 26 on 1 section. And that's and even though the composite is a 33, that's not just a 33, right? Like that's a different consideration. And so it's not just about the composite. It's not just about the super score. If you're applying to schools that do super score, it's also about how you got to that number. And depending on the schools that you apply to and depending on how they see scores, that's another wrinkle. So some schools, even if you self-report on the Common App, the scores are suppressed, so they don't see them, and their computer system on their end may just give them that super score or that best, or that composite if they don't super score. Other places, they're going to see the section scores. So you have to kind of know what you're dealing with before deciding where to send what. And it may not be just the composite that you have to think about. It will often, for plenty of students, you really have to think about the section scores, not only if one is, kind of exceptionally lower or significantly lower than the other ones, but you have to pay attention if you are indicating a major or if you are applying to a particular college or school within a university. Once you start making those indications, it's going to trigger them to look more closely at certain things. So if you're applying to business, they're going to look at your math curriculum a little bit more closely. They're going to look at your math scores a little bit more closely than if you didn't apply to the business program. Same thing with like pre-med. They're going to look a little closer at your science and math curriculum and at the scores when they're ones that, are in those areas. And so again, everything has to really be thought through and isn't sort of, as I think, generic as we might think. So a lot of it depends, so just things to consider.
And Leslie, there's a question in the chat about the new SAT really quickly before we move on, and about whether or not sophomores should spend any time preparing for this old SAT. And the answer is no. I mean, unless they are going to really test early next year in the fall before things change, and certainly there are kids who can do that. Most current sophomores will expect to need to test at some point in 2024. And the old SAT and the new SAT they're not going to be similar enough for them to be useful. So I would not prep for the old SAT if you're a current 10th grader. Yeah,
they're going to be too different. Another question that came in, is it better to not submit scores if they're on the lower end? Yeah, like if they're on the lower end, that's easy. Like, do not send them. Even if it's a school that kind of clearly has a preference for scores, if you give them lower scores, you're just handing it to them on a platter. So at least go for the test optional and see if you're in the minority of students that they take without scores. But giving them the lower scores is just giving them a reason, to put you either on the wait list or to deny. So I wouldn't send lower scores, no.
Barry, can you just, or actually, Sasha, can you just elaborate on what super scoring is, just in case some, people don't know?
Sure. So when you take either the SAT or the ACT, as Barry said, there's the overall score. Maybe it's a 1550 on the SAT or a 34 on the ACT. And then there's the sort of sub scores, how you did on the verbal section and the math, it's SAT, and how you did on the English, the math, the reading, and the science on the ACT. And if you just send your scores from one day, they'll see the overall score and the sub scores. And if you send multiple days, many schools, though not all, will allow you to mix and match the best scores across multiple days. So if you took the SAT once and you got a 750 on one section and 800 on another because you're doing great, feeling really great, and then you take it again and you flip, you get an 800 on the other section and a 750, the super score is a perfect score. The super score is the combination of the two best scores, or scores over multiple days. And, Barry can go into this in more detail, but there, whether or not a school super scores is important, and you can check. And on top of that, what they expect to see with the Superscore matters. Barry sort of referenced this. Are they going to see the subscores and the best, or are they just going to see the best? And some schools will allow you to self-report scores, which really means that they're not going to see the hidden scores you don't want. They'll see you took it twice. They'll see the Superscore. Some schools don't allow you to self-report, and you will be sending those score reports, both of them, should you want to Superscore. Barry and I are going to always agree on this, right? We want a concise testing portfolio that doesn't make anyone flinch, that just sort of, as Barry just said, make sure that you get right over that bar. And Superscoring can be great. It can be really useful. Certain schools, it will be incredibly effective. Other schools, it's irrelevant. So again, it's really about school by school. We don't go for Superscores. We go for one and done, not one in one time, but one score to send. But most kids rely on, 2 for many schools, if not 3 for some schools, whether or not the school's policies allow that.
And just a couple of points of like some nuances on self-reporting and scores. So Superscoring, sort of a term that sort of more I associate with ACT, in the sense that, I mean, we use it for both, but the SAT, pretty almost every single school is going to take the best section scores from SAT. But not all schools that take the best section scores from the SAT are going to allow you to do the same for the ACT. So there is a distinction depending on which test you're taking to kind of clarify on Superscoring. Does that apply to both SAT and ACT for a particular college, or only to ACT? I don't know that I can think of any example where it only applies, where it doesn't apply to reverse. So, but the self-reporting thing, so pre-pandemic, it was already on the rise. Once the pandemic hit, most schools, not all, but most schools will allow you, as Sasha said, to self-report on the Common App. That means you enter the scores on the Common App. You don't need to send official scores when you apply. You will ultimately send official score reports in the spring once you know where you are enrolling, and you're doing that as part of a final verification process, so they can just confirm that what you reported is accurate, but you're just self-reporting on the application. Now, if you're doing that for the SAT, it's straightforward. You give them your best, verbal score, your best math score. You can see that. On the ACT, when you self-report on the Common App, they're going to ask you for your best English, reading, math, science, and then they ask you for your best composite. They do not ask you for the Superscore of those best 4 section scores. And this is a very important distinction. So if they Superscore, their computer will do the computation to give you a Superscore, but you are not reporting the Superscore. So if your best composite is, these numbers might not make sense, but, if your best composite is, a 32, but your Superscore is a 34, you're putting the 32 on the self-reporting. So it's just an important thing to remember that even for a self-reporting school, if you're an ACT kid, that you can't necessarily hide the single best composite. So, and sometimes there's a big gap between the single best composite, or a meaningful gap, which, by the way, on the ACT on the higher end can be 1 point. And it matters, and other times, like, it doesn't matter, for depending obviously what they are. So that's important. And then I think those were the issues that I just wanted to mention. I think they're important, especially for the seniors who are applying now.
And it certainly goes to the question, and there's another question in the chat, but it's all related to sending scores, and do they see the scores, and can they see the scores, and who sees the scores? And the ACT and the SAT are a little bit different about what they allow you to do and what they don't allow you to do. But overwhelmingly, in this landscape, you have a lot of control, overwhelmingly, over what schools see. So the scores will go into your account, College Board account if you do the SAT, or your ACT account if you do the ACT. And the ACT allows you to just delete them whenever you like. And the SAT doesn't do that. And that worries parents. I know it worries them that those scores are sitting there, and it can be psychologically stressful. But as Barry said, self-reporting is the norm. It's not the exception anymore, meaning you don't need to send everything to the schools. You will be able to choose what they see, even if you are sending
just real fast, Sasha, to clarify, even if you can't self-report and you have to send the official scores, you just send the ones you want. And exactly. It's very, very difficult to make a mistake on that. You check them off on the ACT. You can only send one test date at a time. So you're doing different transactions for each of them. Some people delete them. Why bother is my thought. Why are you deleting them? No one has to see them, but if it makes you feel better, go ahead. But it really, you have the control, like Sasha said, over what you're sending. So you don't have to fret if they're they're in your account. Nobody's going to see them unless you actually go ahead and send them yourself.
Lots of safety valves in place, and you're only testing when you're ready. When things really go wrong, lots of things in place to make sure no one sees those scores.
Yeah, and we have a question here. It says 2 questions. What is the average number of times a student takes the SAT? I don't know literally, like what's the formal, like official answer for the national pool, but I would say we tell people, listen, in an ideal world, in an ideal world, one and done. That's not the reality for like 99% of people. So ideally, if you can do it in 2 sittings, great. But if not, it's 3. And, we don't think about beyond 3.
Yeah, and
Does it ever happen that someone takes it, an extra time? Sure, but like that's not the plan at the outset.
You know what I see is so typical is a kid comes to us and says the goal is a 34, maybe, and we, you take it once, they get their 32. We knew that it was the trial run. They take it the second time, they get their 34, and then they say, well, Barry would like me to have a 35. And we say, okay, take a break. You're good. You have your 34. Barry's not worried. She's not worried right now. You have a 34. It's the end of junior year. You need to focus on your exams, take a break. And then they come back to it and maybe try it in the fall of their senior year with very little pressure, very little test prep. And that third time is a sort of different thing. And the first time is usually the trial run. The second time is usually the sweet spot. And the third time is usually that like extra thing we're doing without a lot of pressure, usually further down the line in a very different way. That's just very typical. And there is no typical kid. Some do them once, some do them 4 times, most do them twice, but there's always just sort of a different strategy depending on, and then how much work you put into it, how much time, all that stuff.
And I think I see all the time, it's not that we don't expect it, but it's certainly well worth giving it a try, is seniors who go back to it and have taken a really true like break from tutoring, from thinking about it, going in a little older, a little wiser, a little fresher, can really yield meaningful for us results. And again, sometimes it's a point on an ACT, but ask anybody who's moved their composite a point, it's not insignificant. And so we really see a lot of promise in senior year testing. Again, nothing's guaranteed, but we see it so consistently that it's well worth being part of the longer term plan if you need to use it. And if you can be done by the end of junior year, fantastic, but so many people are not. I think at least half of our students are not, probably more.
And I will say what Barry's also talking about is the mental, right? The mental component of this, right? So she's talking about that rested, confident senior, and we love a rested, confident senior because we love rested, confident kids testing, and that performance element is so important. But that's also where all that planning comes in early. If you have a fall sport that's insane, if you have a summer that's kind of empty, not empty because you have interesting things happening, but you have a lot of time for prep. If you're a boarding school kid, if you're a kid who's going to the mountain school in February and will be away all semester, every kid has different things that has an impact on their time and their ability to take on what is essentially sort of like another course, right? Another class, another burden, this ACT or this SAT. And so that timing and being thoughtful about it, as Barry said, and it's one of the reasons I don't have a lot of kids test in May and June. Of their junior year, it's nationally a very busy time for testing for juniors. But our juniors are either done or taking a break, or because they're so exhausted from the rigors of schoolwork. And we know the value of those grades and the value of their mental health. And we know that children don't perform well when fatigued and when stressed and when waning in confidence. So I think all of that is essential when planning this whole thing out.
To balance that, Sasha, one other thing that comes up a lot is people feel sometimes that I'm going to start early in 10th grade because 11th grade is going to be so bad. And so I'm going to start prepping in 10th grade. And by the way, it's very logical. Let me start earlier. Let me not have it overlap with the most stressful time. Let me have longer to prep. Even if it does end up overlapping, at least I'll have done it for a long time. Sasha, you can speak to what your experience is, but mine is that just leads to burnout and you're having kids starting to test usually before they're ready. For me, the kids who should be testing early are the ones who are natural test takers and can get it out of the way quickly and just do it, log their score and move on. But if you're the kind of student who really needs the prep, being a little bit further along in school. And again, even if you have a plan, you create a plan around your life. Nobody has the extra time. It's going to be the same thing when you work on your applications. I mean, I've never met a student who's like, I've got all the time in the world. What do you need me to do? I'm available. But you work around it. And like Sasha said, the more you plan, the better you're able to do it in a way that feels more civilized, and where you feel like when the bumps come, or when when you need to take a pause, there's no stress with it, because you've planned enough ahead, to anticipate those things. But I don't know, Sasha, if you've had a different experience with early testers.
Absolutely. I mean, early testers are testers who are usually a little bit ahead in math. You have to be done with Algebra 2 Trig to even think about this test. So maybe you have some kids who have done that a year ago. They're in pre-calc. They are going away for a semester. They go to boarding school, heavy fall schedule, and they are going to knock it out of the park over the summer before junior year. That's rare. And what Barry said about that, that's not drawn out. That is a targeted, focused, intensive, and we're done before things get crazy. In terms of the long programs, which I really try to avoid on so many levels, but the only thing I can say is, let's make sure by the time we're ready for these diagnostics, which is the end of 10th grade, let's call it, that there aren't any major skill or content deficits. Because what shouldn't take very long is giving them the rules of the game, and then working intensely with them so that that game becomes very familiar and they can perform under pressure when the game does what it does, which is make things very challenging when the clock is running and the kid next to you is tapping his pencil, right? So that's the part that is complicated, and it's not easy, but it's not long either. Particularly the performance element. The long part is making sure you have all the math, that you read at a certain level, that your sort of those skills and those content pieces are developed. And so what worries me more, frankly, is the kid who has memorized every piece of math, but never understood the concepts. That was maybe me a little bit in 9th grade, and then can't come back to the ACT and see all this mixed math it really was never there to begin with. That's what's going to take time and what will drag out a program that really shouldn't be long. And so in that sense, if you're a parent of a 9th grader or a 10th grader, let's focus in on those academic skills, make sure they are really solid. And if that foundation's there, the game is the game. It's not so hard to teach. It doesn't take so long. And then we're working with kids' confidence and all that important stuff that teenagers go through.
And grades, are they more important than the scores? Are they the same? How would you? I don't know.
I mean, grades are going to be more important, because without the grades, it doesn't matter what your score is, and so, but, there's going to be an academic review, at many schools, maybe most schools is probably correct to say they're going to give an academic rating or ranking, based on a number of different factors. But then once you pass through door number 1, which is sort of that initial academic review, it's behind you. And in most pools, you've got about 80% of the kids still remaining. So this is definitely getting rid of some people, but not nearly enough, that this is what's going to be the determining factor. So grades are behind you now. It's kind of like door number 2. Ultimately, decisions are made on the softer factors. So grades are the most, rigor is the most important. Grades follow. Most people will just say the transcript, but there's really 2 very important and distinct parts to a transcript. But grades will matter, because if you don't have them, you're either not going to be part of the conversation, or it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to be part of the conversation. But once you have like a seat at the table, the final decisions will be made on all these softer factors, not just what you did extracurricularly, but how you engaged in it, what you got out of it, how you communicate that. How does your profile come together as a whole? How does the person that you're presenting kind of jive with what the recommenders are saying about you? There's like it's a whole picture that's being painted as they get through this application. In the essays is really the only time you get to speak truly. Even if you have an interview, it's the essays where your voice really is, and where they are expecting you to kind of speak directly to them. And then there's this fit piece, which we know is very different from match. And it has nothing to do with how much you think you fit there or how much you want to go there or how well you can do the work. It just has to do with how their admissions office works and how they perceive students who are a good fit for their community. And so these are sort of the deciding factors, but grades have to be there. Without them, none of the other stuff will matter. On the score front, now we have test optional at almost all places. And so, we have some flexibility there that we didn't have a few years ago. But they're still important. There's still things that we encourage each of our students, go for it. Like, we'd love to be able to submit scores if we can. If we can't, we won't. But if we can, we would like to. For some students, they're going to submit scores to some of their schools and not others. It's not going to be a blanket thing where they go to every school. For some kids it will be, but not for all. But what we did know before test optional for the schools because there were schools pre-pandemic that were test optional, but for most of the schools which weren't, we did know that a low score would knock you out, even though they never would say that publicly. But a low score would, and it still would, which is why if you have a low score, just don't send it.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I also was nodding about the academics being more important, besides that they're the thing that kind of just gets you in or doesn't, right? In the beginning, it's so important from the admissions perspective, but also two other things. One is you can't redo it the way you can with SATs and ACTs. There's other chances, there's other dates, you can hide your scores, things happen, you don't have to send them. When you have a chemistry test, when you have a rough 9th grade, and Barry will tell you it starts in 9th grade, does not start in 10th, it does not start in 11th, it starts right away. When you have those things, those things make it much more difficult. You can't undo it. You can't change your transcript. You can't redo chemistry. And from a sort of educational perspective, learning truly builds on itself, right? So should there be real deficits? Should there be issues with the grades? Well, hypothetically, or we hope that means that there's something behind that, right? And so if there is something that's a struggle academically, be it executive functioning or a conceptual issue, we need to address that always. That's always matters, and it will always matter for what comes next, and will always be something that compounds over time, for good or for bad, when you address it earlier, when you don't. So I'll just say those things. And so if it's about ACT versus a chemistry test, I mean, we want both, but the chemistry test you can't redo.
Yeah, I think it's about prioritizing. You always should be prioritizing your grades. You fit in the score, the prep, the extracurriculars, like all the stuff, you have to figure out how to weave that in. But whenever the question is, should I study for the test or do the other thing? 99.9% of the time, the answer is study for the test.
And Sasha touched upon this. Barry, do all 4 years count? And what are the grades you need for those top schools?
So all 4 years count. Listen, if you have an inconsistency in your transcript, better for it to pop up earlier rather than later. Ideally, it's as close to perfect as you can get, close to all A's. And I mean, for me, all A's, you have some A minuses, who cares? Like, I'm not getting that picky, but there's a big difference between a B+ and an A-, even though there really isn't. But on a transcript, there's a big difference. So, what do you need? First of all, again, even if you have what you need, it doesn't mean you're getting in. It just means you can pass through, and that part won't hold you back. So I also don't want to misrepresent. But I mean, listen, if you're looking at highly selective schools, you want to get as close to all A's as you can get. Now, a big question about that is curriculum, right? So do you want to get all A's and take easier classes? Actually, no. You want to try to, if you ask this question in an information session at a school and they say, would you want me to take the AP class and get a B, or the honors class and get an A? They always give the same answer. Take the AP class and get an A. Ha, ha, ha. And then the room chuckles. But they're being honest, is that is what they want. But if you can't deliver on that, you need to make some decisions. Sometimes one class, if we know, listen, it's going to be a B, we can handle it. It's more important, the rigor, than the grade in that particular instance. We might actually make the choice to take the B. In just as many instances, I can tell you that, we're not going to take the B. You're going to, go for the higher class. go for the lower class and then say, okay, listen, and it depends where you're shooting for. It depends what your other classes are. The call we're going to make about one particular class, nothing is in a vacuum. So, well, what are the other classes? What do the other years look like? Which schools are you shooting for? How good of a fit are you? Are you submitting scores? These are all parts of the decision-making process. So in an ideal world, you're taking the most rigorous curriculum that's available at your school. And it's always based on what's available at your high school. They're not comparing you to kids down the street or at other places that people might compare your school to. So taking the most rigorous curriculum that's available at your high school and ideally doing quite well in it. But perfection isn't the name of the game either. I can give you so many examples where transcripts weren't quote unquote perfect and all worked out just fine. So it is very much a case by case basis. But if you were saying, what are you shooting for? That's what you're shooting for. But that curriculum, those curriculum choices are extraordinarily important. I always say this, the transcript is the most important thing, but the transcript, like I said before, is in two parts. There's the classes that you're taking and then the grades that you're earning in them. If I had to break it down, I would put rigor in slot number 1, grades in slot number 2, and then, scores if they're being submitted, and then go down from there.
So AP classes, you would say?
If they're available, yeah.
They're available at fewer and fewer at the private schools in New York and many of the boarding schools where their curricula is so flexible and so incredible. A lot of schools have moved away from APs. Not all. A lot of them have moved away from APs to just very advanced courses that sometimes lend themselves to AP exams and sometimes don't. Some schools still have AP courses. And so it's what Barry was saying. If your school offers AP courses, those are going to be the most rigorous courses available. You need to take them, and you need to take them with the level of rigor that your counselor and your advisors help you understand is expected for the top schools. And if they don't have AP courses, no one faults you for it. You take whatever's rigorous at your school. And certainly the admissions officers, and Barry can speak to this more, they know the school too. They know what, and the transcript tells you a lot about that as well. So AP courses, AP exams, if you're in an AP course, you should sit for the exam, right? It's sort of expected if you're in the class that you sit and you do well in the exam. So should your child be in that course, that's important. Otherwise, we have actually lots of kids take those exams for college credit, or they take them because they're easy 5s, which is the perfect score. Otherwise, it's like everything else. It's an opportunity cost. What is the cost of preparing for that exam, for sitting for that exam? They are a very small part of this process overall. And they're really only important if you have AP classes at your school.
Yeah, I rarely, if ever, encourage somebody to take an AP exam if they're not in the AP class, regardless of the fact that other kids at your school are doing it. I do not care. Like, it's not going to make a difference just because, the other kids are doing it.
Harry, will schools look at where your transcript is coming from, one school versus another, and how does that weigh in?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up a lot. People will say, well, at my school, it's harder to get an A. And so, like a B is like an A+ or an A at any other school. And well, maybe, but there are people at your school getting A's. So it might be harder, and that may very well be the case, but it doesn't mean that a B is an A. That's wishful thinking. It would be nice, but they're not going to look at it that way. And so again, it's always in the context of your school. And so listen, if you go to a school, and I want to be careful with the wording here. When I say is known to be very rigorous, a lot of people have certain presumptions about their school, but even at places that maybe we would all agree at that are highly regarded academically, again, there are no free passes. And so, and I think you'll see if you think about your school and where kids go, it kind of sprinkles about, right? Based on who the top students are and who the, almost top students are. And it's not exact, there's always going to be little bits of gray as you kind of move from one tier to the next. But everybody is not getting into the top school because, you know, an A is an A++ and a B is an A and a C is a B. I mean, that's just not the way that it works. So I do think you're looked at in the context of your school. I think it can be a little bit more helpful, the kind of question that this is for B students, not because then you're going to get into A-level schools, but you might get into a school that doesn't typically take a B student. And if you're, I mean, like, again, strategy, are you applying early? Is the fit there? But I think sometimes it can benefit a B student a little bit more. But I can also tell you that I've had students who chose to attend schools that have a very fine name and were B students, and they would have been better served in the process if they were at a different school and they were A students. And so it's not quite so clear cut.
And this is why finding fit, I mean, Barry can talk about it from the college perspective, but the fit for your child is so important in high school, not just so they can be the top of their class and you put them somewhere easy where they can get A's. That's not that, but it's a place where they thrive and where they develop these educational tools over time so that they can then go on to the right school for them for college. And if they are in the wrong place, not only will the grades reflect that on some level, but also there's other ripple effects of that, certainly.
I want to switch over to some parenting questions. What are the best tips for minimizing friction during the test prep process, admissions process, college essay writing?
Yeah. Well, I'll start and then I'll hand it over because I like to joke that I want nothing to do with the college essays. That's why I give them to Barry. But no, when it comes to, because listen, I'm a parent, I have my own parents, but when it comes to all of these things, there's a few things I will say. One is that I think wrapped up in this process, and we should acknowledge this as parents, wrapped up is that your child's going away from home and that you're working together to figure that out. And that of course comes with a lot of feelings. So I'm very sympathetic to everyone involved because you're thinking, oh, I hope they get into the right school and a good school. And I hope that I give them all these options and they're working, of course, but there's also the separation that's about to happen. And it's important to understand that that's part of why so much friction comes up, I think, in this part of the process. And then the other thing I would say, and I do it myself, is you have to have someone else involved. It can't be you. You're there to love. You are there to listen. You are there to support. You are there to hold them when it is hard. You are not there to be the person who tells them all the bad news about the college list and all the frustrating homework they have to do. And let that be someone else, so that you can be the other thing. If you are able to do that, I truly see it work so well for so many parents, and they can preserve that relationship that is so important, while someone else does the annoying part. That's my advice, Barry.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, the hope is that you can be there as a support and that you can participate and talk about the good stuff and even the hard stuff, but in a supportive way. But if you're the one, kind of like Sasha said, delivering, news about the college list and did you do this? Did you do this? Are you doing this? It usually doesn't end well. And by the way, it's like, it's not your job to know what, Vanderbilt wants compared to Northwestern. Like how are you to know? So I think it's also asking people to do a job that is outside of most people's, areas of expertise. You can work with an outside counselor like us, you can work with your school counselor, but have somebody else who is going to be involved in a meaningful way throughout the process who will be able to do that, know your kid well enough, know you well enough to be able to guide you in a way that's consistent with your approach to this process. We often ask people like, what do they see as a successful outcome? And, there's wildly different answers to that question. And, you need to kind of have somebody that you can go to for advice where you ask the advice. Certainly you don't have to take every single piece of advice given to you, but you go to for the advice because you're going to hear conflicting information about every part of this process. Send the scores, don't send the scores, try for that school, do not try for that school. It's a waste. This school wants this. No, they actually don't. And like everybody is an expert on this. I will tell you, I cannot go out to dinner without having
Same.
somebody like around me talking about the college process. I have asked to move my seat on occasion. I have tried so hard when people are talking so authoritatively. I'm like, it is not true. Like, I literally want to like burst.
Well, and never more than when it comes to those applications that are so easy to mess up and so easy to get your hands in, and you want your kid
Like,
to be
this
represented
person
so
got in here and
beautifully.
this is why, as if you actually know. I mean, the whole thing. And so I just think there's so much like around you to sift through. And it's at the end of the day, it's like, what's good for my kid, like her or his situation, given again, what the goal is, what everything really looks like, how it's going to come across. And you should have somebody that you can go to when you have those questions where you can see it from both sides, who will give you an answer that you can then say, like, you know, for the most part, you know, again, you don't have to take every piece of advice, but that makes sense. Like, that's what's the right thing for us to do. And then you don't sit up at night, like second guessing it, and you move on and you move forward confidently. And when you get the information you're being given, you can make decisions that you feel confident are right for your kid and your family. And so I think having like that objective third party, it makes the process easier, of course, and I'm obviously biased, but again, even if it's at your school, like, you know, you really need somebody who's going to be with you the whole way through and be able to give it to you straight, because most people that, well, and I won't say all the people that we work with, they want to hear it straight. Like, tell me, is it worth it or not? But they also don't want you to kind of set, you know, lower things just to make it easier. Of course we're not. You can be ambitious and also strategic and also have a dose of realism to make sure you're not overshooting and you're using every advantage you could possibly have to your benefit. You know, and so just having someone you're aligned with, I think, is important. But if, you know, for my own children, when it's time, like, for me, it's really all about, yeah, I'm not working with them. Like,
Please, I'm like, oh my God, my own children. I'm like, why haven't you brushed your teeth? Why haven't you brushed your teeth? I wish I could outsource that annoying nagging about brushing their teeth so I can see how it will be when it's the time.
But I think if you can just be the support and like be like, that's the dream. You know,
and
not to be the
parents,
taskmaster and not where everything then is like, you told me to go for you told me to do, right? Like, we've all been there for a variety of reasons.
and those parents who are on their second or third kid always come back and go, oh, I shouldn't have stressed. I mean, we all know that in life, right? We worry, and then we realize, oh, we didn't need to worry so much. So, and the other thing is, you know, if you do work with someone like Barry, or if you work with, you know, someone at school, you really have to work with that person, because I have seen so many people ask the uncle, the friend, the other counselor, and you will get 5 opinions, and that will make everyone, particularly the child who's trying to express themselves on this application that they've never done. I've seen it so many times. So it's that one person, it's not 10, it's not 5. It's that one person. I think that helps the parenting too.
That is a very important point, especially as we're in the midst of essay writing.
You know, I'm like, for Barry's sake,
a wise point to make.
That was for you, Barry.
Is there, you know, is there a way also to be supportive in helping your child find the right fit in terms of a college?
I mean, I think, listen, going on the visits, I think actually, you know, keeping your mouth shut is one of the best things that you can do. Colleges don't want, no offense, but colleges don't want to hear from parents anyway. Not that you can't ask a question, but it should not be the parent kind of, we have these questions, or even just being the one who asks all the questions. One of the things that we do, you know, we meet directly with students, because part of it is helps us get to know them, and that helps us be more effective in essay writing and fit and all that. But it also prepares the student for when they meet admissions officers, either in their school or when they go visit. They can actually speak to them about themselves in the context of the college process, and do so in a meaningful and substantive way. And so everything is a teachable moment, and everything is kind of practice for, you know, for the real thing. And so I think that, you know, if you can do visits and, you know, listen at the first question to be, what did you think to your kid? Don't just say what you thought, like ask them what they thought, listen to them. Maybe, okay, right? Like, you don't even have to respond what you think unless they ask you. You know, and so I think sometimes so often, right, as parents, the hardest thing is actually staying quiet. And it doesn't mean you can't weigh in at any point, but I think if you give your kid the space to try to figure it out. If they want your help, they'll ask. And it doesn't mean if they don't ask, again, in some ways you can't give, but like, it's not uncommon for parents to come to me and say, listen, we did these visits. This is what, so-and-so thinks, these are my thoughts. I would love to hear, kind of what you think, or, is this something you might want to, could you talk about with, so I really think on the visit front, like the more you ask your kid what they think and don't feel compelled to start talking and telling what you think unless they ask. By the way, like if you can do that, they usually come around to like what you think. But once you say something that you want, it's not usually the fastest, easiest path. And so I think the more freedom you give them, as long as there's an adult, like, whether it's me again, or somebody at school or another counselor, whatever, as long as you have an adult kind of like helping them frame things and kind of helping guide them, shouldn't probably be that they're off completely on their own with this, but, I would say, ask questions as opposed to offer opinions is probably pretty good advice.
Do you want to look through any questions that we may not have?
Yes, there are a couple actually. One question is just, do you ever have anyone try to take both the SAT and the ACT? And Sasha and I will both say like, no. Pick one, take both full length practice tests, spread them out, a couple weeks, whatever it is. Get like somebody like Sasha to look at your results and really give you the real analysis, because it's not just about, oh, this score was higher, this score was lower. What kind of questions did you get wrong? Are they the kinds that are more coachable, less coachable? Were they easy or the really difficult ones? All of that and more is going to go into which is the better test for you. And it might be that they're both even. And if somebody as expert as Sasha says, it could go either way, you pick the one you like better. And oftentimes there'll be one where somebody like Sasha will tell you, listen, this is the one that's going to be the easier one to kind of coach up. And so you need to speak with somebody, not like myself, because that's in the weeds, too in the weeds for me. I'm going to tell you, take the SAT, the ACT, whichever one you can give me the better score, just so I can use it, or, scores don't get in our way. But, and I'll tell you when you can stop. I'll tell you my thoughts about when you should take it. But I can't tell you which is the better test for you in the way that you need to know, which is where Sasha and her team come in. But I would never take both unless, like Sasha said earlier, you try with one, you realize you made the wrong mistake, you made the wrong decision for whatever reason, and then you pivot. But that is unlikely. That doesn't happen frequently. And it's certainly something you want to try to avoid if possible. There's a question, I'll say it, but there's not really a clear answer. What is the lowest end of scores for both tests when applying to the most competitive school that you would still advise to send? Post-pandemic, the range has gotten narrower and narrower. So this really would be specific to certain schools where I might say, it has to be a 35 or a 34 is okay or not. It just depends.
In terms of quickly materials for the new SAT, they're supposed to, the College Board says this fall, they're not out yet. They're coming, they'll come on Khan Academy, they'll come on the website. Other companies like Test Innovators, whom we love, will come up with software to do adaptable things. But right now, nope, it's not here yet. We're waiting.
Thank you. That's an important piece, especially as changes come. Another question here, it seems that the unintended consequence of test optional is significantly higher average submitted scores compared to past average test scores. How are colleges addressing this? They are not. They're taking kids with higher scores. It's a good question, but they're not addressing it. And another unintended consequence is that the application, obviously, the numbers are going beyond through the roof. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier that's, I think, an important piece about the scores is that one of the reasons, there's a few reasons why we'd ideally like to give them if we can, but one of the reasons is that your results become more predictable with the score. Without the score, the predictability is a little bit tougher. It's not impossible, but it complicates things. It just gives us one less data point. And so if you can give the scores, it also can give you a little bit more clarity about your list and like chances for admission. But unfortunately, colleges aren't addressing it except to tout how high their new averages are and how low their admit rates are.